Thank you, Lev, for the introduction. And we will be speaking about the threat of subterranean challenges from a threat perspective, from a psychological threat perspective. And when we talk about threats, the first thing that we need to understand is that there is a very significant gap between our perception of threats and the reality of threats. So if you look at the two pictures here, one is of a missile attack and the other is just a lump of sugar. It is much more likely that the sugar will pose a threat to each and every one of us here than missiles. Nevertheless, it's more likely that missiles will appear more threatening to us. In other words, we tend to both overestimate and underestimate threats. We see some threats as very, very scary and very threatening, even though the chances of actually being hurt by the threat is very low, and we see other threats as relatively benign, even though we should be much more worried about them. And when we talk about threat, it's impossible to really discuss this issue without talking about political ideology, because the research in psychology about threat shows that there are major, major differences between liberals and conservatives, right-wingers and left-wingers around the world, or at least in the Western world. And there are several models that discuss these differences. One model, which is the more dominant model in the field today, is called the conservative shift perspective. And according to this model, threats are a conservative issue, they are a right-wing issue. Right-wingers are the ones who respond to threats, they see threats, and when presented with threats, right-wingers become more right-wing. I do not agree with this perspective, to some extent at least, because I believe that this perspective misses threats that left-wingers are also concerned with. And in the model that I developed along with my colleagues, the multidimensional existential threat model, we define different types of threats along three main axes. Personal collective, whether the threat threatens me as an individual or the entire collective. Physical symbolic, whether the threat is to physical existence or to symbolic existence, which is identity, who we are as a group. And the threat can either be located in the future or may emanate from the past. I won't get into this entire model, but I will just say that there are major differences around the world that we find between conservatives and liberals when it comes to threat perceptions. So conservatives are much more concerned and much more attuned to physical threats that are concrete, that are immediate, threats that we call threats of commission. In other words, there is an agent who is posing a threat, and these threats appear to be very psychologically close to conservatives. Liberals are much more concerned with threats that are symbolic, that have to do with identity. Threats, for example, to democracy. Threats that are much more abstract. Threats that develop much more slowly and are threats of omission. In other words, these are threats without a specific agent that is posing a threat, but threats that will emerge if we don't stop them from emerging, such as environmental threats. And these are threats that tend to be more psychologically distant. In the current presentation, in which we also present some data, we wanted to see whether there is even a higher resolution of difference between liberals and conservatives, or right-wingers and left-wingers, in physical threat perceptions. So of course we predicted that right-wingers will perceive physical threats to a greater extent than left-wingers, but we thought that different types of threats may elicit a different response. So if we look, I'll go back. If we look at three major threats that face Israeli society, that face Israel, we can think of missiles, which are a very common threat. We can think of a ground invasion, or we can think of tunnels. When we look at three different factors, the likelihood of the threat emerging, the severity of the threat, and the frequency of the threat, then missiles are very likely. Their severity is relatively low up until now, and their frequency has been relatively high. A ground invasion is low in likelihood, higher in severity, and lower in frequency. And tunnels have been low in likelihood, you might say of medium severity, because some people have been killed, and their frequency is very low. So we decided to test these factors and examine to what extent they predict our personal sense of threat. And my colleague, Professor Boaz Ben David, will present the study.
So we have to say that we're very fortunate to be invited here because it made us sit together in the room and try to think what's so unique about tunnels. Why do they, as you said, they're creepy? You said, what's going on? So we have here a survey of 303 Israeli Jews. These are undergraduate first-year psychology students, mostly women, age 20 to 25. Fortunately for us, a third of them self-identify as left, a third as center, and a third as right. And what we told them, oh, you want to see it? Here we go. So here we go. We asked them, we said the following. In Hebrew, of course, there are three major terrorist threats facing Israel today: a missile attack, a surface level, or a subterranean tunnel. Question one, to what extent do you agree that such an attack is likely? Question two, to what extent do you agree that such an attack is dangerous? And then, what's most important for us as psychologists, to what extent do you feel personally threatened? Now, you may say that this is sort of A times B equals Y, but as psychologists, we know that human beings do not act this way at all. So, first, perceived likelihood. As you can see here, tunnels and missiles are perceived as more likely than surface level. Notice tunnel and missiles are perceived as likely by our responders. There was no difference here based on political self-identification. Perceived dangerousness, now tunnels get the first spot, by far. So tunnel attack is perceived as more dangerous than missile or surface, but missile and surface attacks are perceived as equally dangerous. Equally dangerous. Even though, as you said, based on statistics, maybe that is not the case. So now comes our big question. And this is sort of, we apologize, but we have here sort of a logical game here. So we know that tunnels are perceived as more dangerous than a surface level attack. And tunnels are also perceived as more likely than a surface level attack. Ergo, even if human beings are working as an economic being, as a computer, we expect that tunnels should be perceived as more threatening than a surface level attack. That's easy. However, let's see what happens between tunnels and missiles. In our survey, tunnels were perceived as more dangerous than missiles, but less likely than missiles. So if my experience of threat is based on dangerousness, tunnels should be more perceived as more threatening than missiles. If it is based on likelihood, then it should be vice versa. What do you believe? Do you have any idea? What do you think will happen? Which one will be perceived more threatening, tunnels or missiles? Anybody want to bet? Go ahead.
Well, the answer that I often hear is that the missiles, you know when they're coming, you can see them. We have equipment like Iron Dome that that is able to maybe stop them from even landing. But the tunnel is invisible; we don't see it, and therefore it can take us by surprise. Whereas the missile cannot take us by surprise.
Okay, that's an interesting way to understand our theory. Thank you for giving us some food for thought. So let's see the actual data which shows that at least your hypothesis is correct. Tunnels are perceived as more threatening than surface level attack, which we expected, but they're also perceived as more threatening than missiles. So what we seem to have here is that perceived threat seems to be driven by perceived dangerousness more than likelihood. We also have here a correlation analysis, a simple correlation analysis. When we correlate perceived threat and dangerousness, there is a higher correlation than perceived likelihood and perceived threat. So it seems that our feeling that we are afraid of something, it's threatening to us, is driven more by the perceived dangerousness, at least in our survey. But, here comes the but. When you look at data, you usually group people together, which is always a mistake. Well, we decided, okay, let's tease apart those who are self-identify as right versus left plus center. Here we can see as Gilad presented the theory, it's clear that across the board, we see that right-wingers perceive it as more likely, more dangerous, and more threatening to all of the three threats that we presented. This is no surprise. What was interesting for us is we asked specifically about the personal threat. And now we found something that surprised us. If we look at the left plus center, as you can see, this is the level of threat. And it doesn't matter if it's a tunnel, missile, or surface, it's all low and all equally threatening. When we go to those who self-identify as right-wing, we see the tunnels are much more threatening than missiles and surfaces. So there seemed to be something unique about subterranean threats that is way and above and beyond the ability to assess the dangerousness of the situation or to assess the likelihood of the situation. Maybe it is, we have here some ideas, maybe it's because, as you said, it's surprising, we didn't expect it. Maybe because you have to meet the enemy face to face, unlike a rocket that is anonymous, it's not a face. And maybe it's because there is something psychologically innate, maybe only for Westerners, of something creeping below us. If you watch Netflix and TV, you will note that when it's a zombie or any other super being that is not nice, it comes from below, right? Maybe there is something psychologically that means that threat is lurking below us. Hell is below. Beneath you it devours. So there's something below, and we want to understand a bit more about what make us fear these tunnels much more than all the other very likely dangers. Thank you.